Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Monday, the 22nd of December, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Just as a reminder, it is Christmas week, and we will be here for most of the week. We will be here on Wednesday, Christmas Eve. That's the 24th. We will not be here Christmas Day, and we will be back on Friday. We do not observe Kwanzaa here, so we will be back on Friday, the 26th of December. And with that, Robert, good morning. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway.
Good morning, Mike. So over the weekend, it came out that the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency placed 6 career staffers on leave in July after Acting Director Madhu Makala failed a counterintelligence polygraph test. The DHS opened an investigation into whether these staffers provided, quote, false information to the acting director that if they lied to him that he was required to take a polygraph test to access a controlled access program.
Sorry, Robert. Just real quick, just to put this in context. All right, so everyone's probably familiar. You've probably heard of the classifications like secret and top secret, and there's a component of top secret called SCI, or sensitive compartmented information, or sensitive compartmentalized information, SCI, and these are programs or sources of information, databases, or certain collection platforms that require specific read-on. So just because you have a top secret clearance doesn't mean you automatically get access to all of this SCI information. So you have to be read onto those programs individually. And apparently this was not included in the report, the public reporting, but there is some intelligence agency, and that I presume that's probably NSA. I'm not positive because it didn't specifically mention it, but there's a source of there's an SCI program that was going to be provided. Some of that information was going to be provided to CISA. So it had to do with cyber networks, critical infrastructure. And so what happens is, in order to be read on to this SCI program, allegedly there had to be a counterintelligence polygraph. And this guy failed his CI poly, which is a big deal. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're guilty or you're conducting espionage or you're a foreign spy or anything like that. There are several reasons why you might fail a CI poly that is not necessarily reflective on you or your character or what you're doing. But as an indicator, it is something that is substantial that you would take a look at if you're conducting a counterintelligence investigation. So, Robert, it seems fairly serious that this guy failed his CI failed his CI polygraph. And according to this report, he's still the deputy director of CISA, correct? Or excuse me, he's the CISA acting director, because Trump's chosen CISA director has not been confirmed through the Senate yet, even though we're almost a year into the administration.
Correct. And that's been a big problem for the Trump administration, is getting these appointees through the Senate. They have started doing basically large tranches of like 100 at a time, between 45 and 100 at a time. But so far, they've only succeeded, I think, in like the first 2 waves of that in the Senate. And a lot of the times they've been held up by members of the Senate that are trying to get something out of the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Just one other point on this, too. Apparently, this guy, CISA acting director, did not have a need to know this information that he was trying to get access to. But according to and this is just one report on this topic, but apparently he, or at least allegedly, will say he continued to press for access, even though he could have pushed that access and need to know to a subordinate, as in he's acting CISA director. He doesn't need to know every minute detail. And apparently there was another way for him to get some of this information that was lesser classified, that did not require CI poly. And he apparently refused that, and he continued to press for access to the most highly classified information available, which, well, I'll just say, it's interesting whenever someone continues to press for the most highly classified version of information available. And then he also failed his CI poly. I'm not saying that there's fire here, but there's definitely smoke. With that, let's move on.
According to some immigration court data, the Department of Homeland Security filed 5,000 motions to dismiss asylum claims, which would force asylum applicants to apply from safe third countries. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has expanded these safe third country agreements to include Honduras and Uganda, which the Trump, this is a significant increase in DHS asking to dismiss these asylum claims since the Biden administration. So it looks like the Trump administration is trying to overturn the Biden administration policies on asylum claims. Republicans also released a proposed Homeland Security appropriations bill over the weekend, and this would give ICE an additional $700 million in funding next year. This bill would also give the Department of Homeland Security a $66 billion discretionary fund. DHS announced this morning that they are increasing their exit bonus for illegal immigrants who self-deport through the One CBP app. And that exit bonus is going to increase from $1,000 to $3,000 if the illegal immigrants leave the country by 31 December. Moving over to the domestic side, FBI Director Kash Patel announced that Indiana University researcher and Chinese national Yuang Jiang was charged with smuggling E. coli into the United States earlier this year. He attempted to smuggle this E. coli across the border knowingly by hiding it in a package of underwear during a return trip from China. This is the latest in a series of Chinese academics working at U.S. universities that have been caught smuggling these bioagents into the U.S. This one is different because previous bioagents would be likely used to target U.S. agriculture. And E. coli is really only useful for targeting people, specifically through food cross-contamination. And
hey, Robert, just real quick on this. So I've seen people more or less defend this, saying, well, they're researchers, they're researching E. coli, they're researching wheat blight, they're researching, what was it? There was another one that had to do with cherries.
And the cherry fungus.
Okay, they're researching cherry fungus and they're bringing it into the United States so they can study it. Well, that's what some people say. But does that have any weight whatsoever?
No, I'm sorry. It was European fruit fly was the cherry one, and it could normally. I would consider it more suspicious considering like the citrus industry here in Florida, but it's also spread to other states. There was the citrus blight that only previously existed in China that I think started here in the U.S. like 10, 15 years ago, devastated the citrus industry here in Florida and has been hitting other states too. And in the European fruit fly example, that wasn't an academic. That was allegedly a Romanian national. I don't think they ever released I didn't see them release the name of who was caught with that, heading toward like the cherry production center of the United States. But in the case of these Chinese nationals, they're bringing over bioagents that they worked on in China at one of the major research, I think at Beijing University research labs. To me, I think if they had legitimate reasons to bring these bioagents, they wouldn't knowingly attempt to obfuscate bringing them in. And according to the FBI, he admitted that he admitted to the FBI that he knew he needed a permit to bring it in and knowingly attempted to do it anyway. And to me, that would seem to be an indicator that he had some kind of other intention than just research.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially if he hid it in his underwear. And by the way, kudos to the customs or DHS or whoever was sorting through this man's underwear to find this vial of E. coli or whatever he brought over. All right, thanks for that. And then let's move on here to Texas. I saw this headline and I'm getting deja vu all over again of the snowmageddon that we had, where the Texas power grid was apparently maybe hours away from at least partially being destroyed. And now ERCOT and the NERC are coming out and warning that Texas is under greater risk this winter season into 2026 than we were back in 2021.
Well, this is a report from a group called the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and they said that the ERCOT grid is facing a higher risk of winter outages this winter than in 2021 when Winter Storm Uri caused blackouts. I read through the report, and according to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Texas has not actually increased its baseload power capacity since 2021. All of the reported electricity capacity increases are due to renewables and batteries. And they said that this was outweighed by a 20% increase in peak demand since then. I think the batteries point is important because batteries are susceptible to drastic temperature changes. So to me, this does look like a major risk that the Texas grid is facing this winter.
Yeah, and I was looking up that NERC report as well, and there were two parts of the grid that were under increased risk that looked a little bit concerning. Number one was Texas. The other one was the basin, the BECC. I forget what it's called, but the basin. That's the Mountain West. So that includes, like, I think part of Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and that had to do with reserve power margins being basically in the negative. I think is maybe like a worst case scenario or under the most severe strain. Texas was, I think, negative 20% reserve margin. That basin grid, Mountain West grid, was negative 15% reserve margin. So very concerning there. Something definitely to keep an eye on. So thanks for that, Robert. Anything to add, by the way, on that?
Well, I think this goes back to we reported last week about this Trump said they're going to have 1,600 power plants starting construction in the next 12 months. Just the numbers across the board, the U.S. is facing something like a almost 10% decrease in baseload power capacity. A lot of that we've reported on is like here in the Southeast and in the Atlantic seaboard with PJM, but that is a huge decrease in baseload power generation that we're facing. At the same time, we have this huge increase, roughly almost the same level of increase in power demand in the same time frame. And I think Colorado, they just did a public safety power outage, a voluntary power outage of I think it's Xcel Energy is their utility, for exactly this reason. They said it was for winter wind storm event, but a lot of these grids around the country are facing a decrease in capacity and a huge increase in demand. And a lot of that has to do with these retiring coal power plants.
Mm-hmm. Just some details on this. So ERCOT, which is the Texas grid, is negative 20% reserve margin in basically a worst case scenario. That basin, it's WECC basin, is negative 21% reserve margin under extreme conditions. WECC Northwest, which includes Montana westward over to Washington and Oregon, is at negative 8.5% under. That's reserve margin under extreme conditions. So also be cognizant if you're in that area as well. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep. Starting with Venezuela, Jared, there's a lot going on, and it continues to look like, as we've been covering for probably at least 1, maybe 2 months now, that the United States really is appearing to attempt to choke off Maduro slowly. This is not going to be a military invasion, but this is going to be a case where Maduro is forced out either through economic conditions or potentially a military coup or potentially a popular uprising, just looking at the number of ways a president can be forced out of office, into exile, et cetera. What's the latest?
So we've tried to find who the government in waiting would be, because if there's a regime change, there must be a regime that takes power. They announced themselves over the weekend. Eduardo Gonzalez will be the president, is considered the president-elect by this government, and Maria Machado, who we've covered pretty extensively here, she was the one that recently won the Nobel Prize. She will be the spokeswoman for the administration. Now, this group says that they will be, quoting, they will be responsible for issuing official statements and organizing press briefings to provide up-to-date information on the actions and communications of Venezuela's elected leadership. And that last bit is the most important part. That's what they are really running on, is saying, hey, this is the voice of the people. We are the rightful rulers, not Maduro. And then just over the weekend, there were 2 major events on the water. The U.S. seized a second oil tanker as it was leaving Venezuela, and there was a third oil tanker that refused boarding from the Coast Guard and fled with the U.S. Coast Guard in pursuit. Now, there are unconfirmed reports that the U.S. Coast Guard did actually eventually board that fleeing vessel later on in the weekend. I do think that's likely accurate. Can't imagine a multi-day pursuit there, and they're not fast. Additionally, on Friday, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned 5 additional members of Venezuelan President Maduro's family and two more businessmen that are associated with him, all of which, between the tanker seizures and the sanctions, this is meant to cut off his flow of funds in order to maintain power in the Venezuelan territory. And then just next door over in Trinidad and Tobago, Their prime minister declared the Caribbean community as an unreliable partner that is falling apart. And this is due to CARICOM's rebuff of President Trump's immigration policies. The prime minister went on to say that she's going to put Trinidad first and not let CARICOM determine their future. Now, this is important because it mirrors the United States' official stance on international organizations in the national security strategy, particularly preventing the erosion of sovereignty by transnational and international organizations. And this is a small nation pushing back against a small and really not even tertiary yet organization, but it is the first one to do it. And I think we could see more nations just standing up and saying, ignoring or even potentially leaving their regional organizations like this. And then over in Japan, the chairman of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's Research Commission on Security said on Sunday that Japan should consider allowing the U.S. to base nuclear weapons in Japan during an emergency. That's the first public endorsement of an actual loosened policy over in Japan. We've heard a lot of anonymous sources suggesting that they should change. This is the first one where somebody's actually putting his name to saying we should actually bring nuclear weapons into Japan. And I've seen condemnation from China and North Korea on this, talking about proliferation, and South Korea is flirting with the ideas as well. Then over in the United Kingdom, their Labour Party is attempting to delay local elections in 63 different councils where they are projected to lose due to capacity constraints. The delay will be due to capacity constraints. Now, the UK's Electoral Commission chair said that the government lacks a legitimate reason for delay and they risk damaging public confidence here.
Yeah, you think you're supposed to be a democratic country, and now you're delaying elections because you don't want to be thrown out of power. A little bit concerning there. By the way, and just briefly, we've seen the Trump administration criticize South Africa for their treatment of the white minority there. And I've seen a lot of Trump supporters as well asking the administration, mainly on social media, why aren't we doing anything about the censorship and the things that are going on in the UK? And foreign meddling aside, obviously not weighing into that debate, but it sure seems like the Trump administration maybe should forcefully at least write a strongly worded letter to the UK, because it really is a shame to watch what is happening there. And basically the government is continuing to allow it to happen. I'm not sure. Well, we'll leave it at that. I would just end by saying I'm not sure that the administration would allow this. Well, we'll leave it at that for now. I don't want to get in that debate. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on here. We do have a few other things to cover today. 36 protests today. Just as a reminder, protests will be ramping up in spring of next year, probably by March. Moving on, which is not to say that there will be no national level protests, but the big national protests will probably not happen until March. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our Homeland Ops brief. Robert, go ahead.
So CNN released a report over the weekend. They got an inside view into the Customs and Border Protection Academy in September and wrote up a report about this. And according to this report, CBP has significantly expanded its academy. It's now, at least in September, had 1,100 trainees enrolled, which is more than double the 500 trainees that were enrolled in September of 2024. Customs and Border Protection officials also said that funding from the Big Beautiful Bill would allow CBP to expand by 3,000 officers heading into next year. In this report, they also outlined that the CBP Academy reintroduced an expanded offensive driving training, and this was suspended during the Biden administration. This change is apparently due to an internal policy change allowing CBP officers to engage in vehicle pursuits. I think, however, this is likely a sign that CBP is going to become more aggressive next year. While ostensibly the idea is they're taking these offensive driving courses to pursue smugglers across the border, as far as I could find, there was an interview with Border Czar Tom Homan, and there have been months of reporting from DHS and Customs and Border Protection that the encounters at the border have almost dropped to zero. So I think it's likely that CBP is preparing for more federal surges next year. And this offensive driving training is actually in preparation for that, because the rapid response groups that we've seen in some of the more aggressive areas, especially Chicago, a lot of their tactics, techniques, and procedures for disrupting CBP operations have been vehicle focused, either accompaniment patrols or, according to CBP official Greg Bovino, vehicle rammings targeting CBP and ICE vehicles. Over in Minnesota, some activists with a group called the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee said that ICE has shifted immigration raids to what they're calling quick snatch and grabs to evade these activist rapid response groups. I expect to also see this type of change in how ICE is conducting operations in Minnesota to take effect in other Democrat-controlled cities and states where federal surges are currently at or are going to be at next year. And part of this, the reason why I think that ICE and CBP are going to adopt this, is because more of these cities, of these sanctuary cities and states, are adopting policies to restrict where ICE and CBP can stage operations ahead of raids. And one of those in St. Paul, over the weekend, they issued a cease and desist notice to the Department of Homeland Security, and they're demanding that ICE stop using city-owned parking lots to stage raids. Other cities have done this, and so far in Illinois, not just Chicago, but also some of the suburbs around Chicago where ICE was staging operations. And St. Paul officials said they were going to pursue legal action if ICE does not stop using city-owned parking lots without permission. I think in this case and in a lot of these other areas that are adopting these policy changes, this is an attempt to close some gaps in sanctuary city policies. A lot of the policies that have come out since 2019 have blocked ICE and CBP from using state resources, buildings, and demanding that city and state employees assist in immigration operations. But this seemed to be something that was looked over, that ICE and CBP would use city-owned parking lots to stage these raids. And now they're trying to, I think, force ICE and CBP to stage operations prevent them from staging operations where they can make preparations away from observation of these rapid response groups. And then moving over to Louisiana, some activists and residents in Kenner, which is a suburb of New Orleans, are demanding that city officials rein in immigration operations under Operation Catalina Crunch. They specifically, during a city council meeting last week, residents demanded that the city officials stop collaborating with ICE. This is another effective method that the anti-ICE or pro-immigration rapid response groups and activists have used to disrupt ICE and CBP operations during these surges. They've been pushing local officials to block the use of city properties or even attempt to revoke zoning permits for some field offices and detention facilities like Portland, Oregon. And I think in some of these cases, the Democrat-controlled local governments have used this pressure, likely to provide political cover to take actions that they would want to do anyway. And then finally, over in Louisiana, there a group called the Louisiana Interchurch Conference, which is a coalition of multiple Christian denominations. They said they're organizing protests and know your rights training for activists to oppose the federal surge in New Orleans. They said they're also organizing food deliveries and utility payments for illegal immigrants that are hiding from the federal surge. This is another expansion of this anti-ICE coalition. And in this case, I think they're using this interfaith group in order to give more legitimacy to the disruption of the federal surges.
Hey, Robert, on the topic of what's going on in Minnesota, you said ICE and CBP are altering their operations and they're moving to these snatch and grab operations instead of, like, I guess, large kind of footprint, long duration sweeps, I guess. Did ICE say why they're doing that? And let me just set this question up a little bit more with some context. These rapid response groups, for those who don't know, this is basically how they function. You have a handful of sensors in the area. So these are humans who are using these apps or using phone trees or signal chat or whatever communication method they're using. And they're literally just driving around looking for ICE vehicles or a large law enforcement presence. They see something, they see that, they say that, so they report it back. And now this rapid response group is able to push out notifications, text messages, notifications in basically alerts in a signal, the signal chat app. And then you have 5, 10, 20 plus, maybe dozens of protesters or activists then come out in it's why they call it rapid response, because they don't wait for this thing to be over. These activists are intended to mobilize and be on the scene of wherever this immigration enforcement action is taking place. Robert, did I say why they're moving to these kind of short duration snatch and grabs rather than like a persistent presence kind of sweep? Do they think it's bad publicity? Do they want to lower the temperature, avoid potentially violent or fatal encounters?
I don't think ICE has made a statement on this. This is coming from one of those activist rapid response groups, and I think that they are doing this because Minneapolis and St. Paul the rapid response groups there have been pretty effective in disrupting previous ICE operations, and in that case, it's because it's been a large raid. I think the latest one was in November, and some of the rapid response groups there effectively did do some disruptive action, direct action demonstrations and stuff. I think that's why ICE is changing. They're adapting here, according to this activist, because what he said was that these rapid response groups would get a call or their group chat message, and they would show up. By the time they showed up, the arrest was already over. So they were engaging in smaller scale, faster arrests in order, according to this activist, avoid the rapid response groups or get their operations finished before they can show up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. And then Mr. A Observations brings up the point that maybe it's bad publicity or poor polling numbers for Trump, especially heading into the midterms. Maybe that's another reason why they don't want these highly confrontational immigration enforcement actions to take place. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And we do have one other item here. So we have seen this thing called jury nullification happen. Most recently, or at least that I can recall, there was that man in D.C. and he threw a Subway sandwich at an ICE agent or some federal agent, and he was arrested for assault, and it went to trial, or maybe a grand jury did not indict him, or he was acquitted or something like that. Basically, the jury there in that case said, we actually don't think this guy violated any laws when he threw a Subway sandwich at a federal agent. Well, now this has happened again in Los Angeles. And so you have this tow truck driver who, in the middle of an ICE enforcement operation, hooks his tow truck up to an ICE vehicle, a federal vehicle, and tows it, I don't know, a block or two away, or however far it went. And he was arrested, and now he's been acquitted by a jury, correct?
Correct. And he was facing up to 10 years for theft of federal property. But I think this is a problem that the Trump administration has already been facing at a small scale, is the jury nullification. Either the people arrested by CBP, ICE, federal agents for interfering with immigration operations have been acquitted, or in the case of the Subway sandwich guy, in some of these other cases, the grand juries have decided not to indict. And I think the Trump administration is going to continue facing and actually probably face a bigger problem going forward, because it's not just the activists who hide their bias during the jury selection process, but I think also, as you talked about Friday, the increase in an ethnic bloc formation, I think, is going to accelerate this. So in this case, this guy Bobby Nunez, if we see more resistance against ICE and CBP, especially in some of the Democrat-controlled states where you have more Hispanic residents, I think we're going to see more of this jury nullification. And part of this is so one of the well-known public figure, Lee Kuan Yew, was the guy who built up Singapore, and there's a famous interview with him from decades ago where he talks about how multicultural societies can't have juries because they do exactly this. Basically, in a society where you don't have a single governing majority, that the different ethnic blocs will provide legal cover for each other effectively, and you basically have a total disruption of the criminal justice system. I think, as we mentioned earlier in the show, talking about the UK and the Labour Party suspending elections, I think that's also another bellwether that we're seeing in the UK. It hit the news like 2 weeks ago that they're getting rid of juries, and I think it's likely for the same reason. And I think on a larger scale, this is significantly destabilizing.
Mm-hmm. You know, whenever we talk about stuff like this, I always remember that story that Joe Biden told. He recounted this conversation he had with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And according to Biden, Xi Jinping said that democracy will not work in the 21st century. And I remember reading that article in like Politico or somewhere, and just so many people being aghast. This concept of democracy can't work in the 21st century. You may consider that Xi Jinping is correct, and which does not obviously bode well for us here in the United States. But, you know, this breakdown of society into not just ideological blocks, but I mean, just very large gaps now among race and ethnicity and religion and ideology. Last thing I'll say on this before we move on to questions. You know, I gave a presentation starting a year or two ago to a number of political groups in Texas. And one of the things I talked about was national divorce. And, you know, I said, whether or not national divorce happens, can just consider this. Really, I think the United States has three centripetal forces right now holding us together. It is a relatively strong and stable economy. And I say relative because it's relative to other economies around the world that are far less stable and far weaker. A relatively stable and strong dollar. Again, this is in comparison to all other global or most other global currencies, that relativity. And then finally, this still maybe popular belief, which is under some duress, this belief in free and fair elections. Really, it seems to me this country's united along fewer and fewer lines. And I really see those as the three forces that are really holding this country together. And so if we look 5 or 10 years out, the dollar is going to be under more pressure. Our economy is probably going to be under more pressure, especially due to job loss through AI and whatever else is going to happen with U.S. employment. And then free and fair elections. I'm not real sanguine about how the 28 election is going to play out. We'll see. At any rate, those are the three. If those are the three centripetal forces keeping this country together, if that's our key assumption, and we look at all three of those, and we say they're under duress, then you do have to, I think, start to question realistically, what does our system of governance actually look like in another 10 years? And I see this fracturing among racial and ethnic lines, like this big debate parts of this country are having right now about what is an American, and can you be anything and come here and recite the Pledge of Allegiance and now you're an American. And I just see that divide as another fault line here for potentially an earthquake we may be headed towards. So thanks for that, Robert. And with that, we do have some questions that we will get to this morning. Does Texas have any AI data centers? Yeah, so Robert, according to that report from ERCOT, they said, if I recall correctly, they had a bunch of large load requests to hook these basically data centers up to ERCOT, which is the Texas grid. If I recall correctly, it was the equivalent of about 4 million residential homes, the AI data centers. So the answer is yes, there are data centers being built in Texas. I think Virginia still is ground zero. I think Virginia still has the largest by far of any state. But do you recall, or you want to provide any other details on that?
No, I think, yeah, Virginia does have the most. And so that has been one of the big things driving up the projected cost increases, like in PJM, that includes parts of Virginia. That is this huge increase in requests for data centers. I think that there's a chance that, like we've seen previously, that some of them will get paused. A lot of that will be revised down, but it's still, even with that, that's still a significant increase in demand.
Certainly. All right. And then this guy who was arrested for smuggling E. coli in his underwear in his suitcase, what university was he at?
Indiana University.
Indiana. Okay. All right. Jared, have Russia and China reacted to effectively a blockade of Venezuela?
Not more than like, hey, we don't like this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think there was some speculation that Russia might I guess in previous years, Russia basically bailed out Venezuela, I think through providing them funding, I believe. There was speculation about maybe a Russian permanent party, a military permanent party presence in Venezuela. I'm not sure where that went, but it doesn't seem to be happening now for sure. You think it's probably too late for Russia or China to try to step in and save Maduro?
Yeah. If they were going to step in to save Maduro, they should have done that a few years ago. And we've touched on it before, but just real quick, I will say I don't think it's in their interest. Like, it is in their interest to keep him, but it's not so great of an interest that they're going to have to step in, because anything that Venezuela provides, barring the specific kind of crude, Iran and Russia both provide.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, Jared. And I get the sense, too, it's probably too late. Is the United States leaving NATO to stop the possibility of an Article 5 activation? If Italy and other Southern European nations leave the EU, does this create a North and South front for Russia to deal with? So was it Mike Lee, I want to say, who filed a bill to get the United States to leave NATO? I don't think it's the case that we would be leaving NATO to stop the possibility of an Article 5 invocation. It seems more likely to me that the strategic aims of NATO and the strategic aims of the United States are at odds. I just saw in a political article this morning basically saying, Macron and Paris have always considered the United States to be an unreliable ally in Europe, and now Donald Trump is proving them right. And this really is the case where the Trump administration, even going back to the very first administration, has been telling these NATO countries in Europe, you have to do more. We will be pivoting out of Europe. It's your continent. You have to defend it. This is not a case where I think the United States is an unreliable ally. We've been telegraphing this and probably telling them behind closed doors for close to a decade now that they have to be doing more. So I don't think it's the case that the United States may be leaving NATO. I don't think we are leaving NATO, but we have seen these bills now, I guess, in the House and Senate to push the United States out of NATO. But Jared, you don't see that as preventing the possibility of an Article 5 activation. We're probably leaving. The push is to leave NATO because NATO no longer serves the interests of the United States, or what?
Yeah, I have seen some of the pushes for it, and I don't think the administration is going to go that route, because if you read the national security strategy and more importantly, probably the guy behind it, Elbridge Colby's book, I'm drawing a blank on the name right now, but it mirrors that. And what that does is just say, hey, the current most pressing threat is outside of our hemisphere is China. That doesn't mean that Russia can't eventually be a threat. So why would we give up NATO? It's just that for the moment, basically every resource that the Trump administration has to be set to the Western Hemisphere to secure it, and the Asia Pacific to make sure that they're ready for the Davidson window, along with the coalition that's there. And Europe does need to step up and actually maintain its interests, which includes rearming itself, just plain and simple. And if we're heading toward a multipolar world, as has been broadly said for well over a decade now, they should be able to defend themselves anyways, because the U.S., frankly, it's going to face all of the tyranny of distance issues again over in Europe that it is for Asia, just not to the same extent. Like, they need to be strong allies. They need to be. And in the national security strategy, you can tell that that's really what they're pushing for, is it's make the European civilization great again. That's in there. That the Trump administration doesn't want a weak Europe. They want a strong Europe to cover the European side. Mm-hmm. So I don't see us leaving NATO at all, because if anything, we're strengthening it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're strengthening NATO by getting them to do more and the United States to do less for them. All right. Next question here. Assuming Maduro is replaced, sanctions lifted, Venezuela reintegrated, investment flowing in, oil production potentially doubling, would this lead to low energy prices and lower input costs in the medium term for the United States? I would say over the medium term, probably yes. It would obviously take time to go into Venezuela and rebuild that infrastructure that's been probably poorly run and poorly funded. I would say this, more important than that, I think, is this whole concept of Fortress North America and hardening the Western Hemisphere. If the United States' long-term strategy really is to pull back to the Western Hemisphere, obviously maintain a foreign presence, a foreign military presence in certain areas that are decisive to the United States. But if we really are going to pivot back to the Western Hemisphere, you are going to want another source of oil to run the Western Hemisphere. It seems like potentially that's Venezuela. Yeah. Jared, how would you answer this question?
I think it would lower them. Certainly not in the immediate term. You're going to have instability there. Just plain and simple. That's kind of how Venezuela operates for all of the 20th century. But I think toward the mission of Fortress America, there's also a push to develop the rest of Latin America, get them on side, and that would provide Latin America a significant energy source. You could potentially, actually industrialize, move a few. I think they could use that to actually really build up the Western Hemisphere and make it into a proper fortress, instead of just looking to make the gas tank a little bit easier to fill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that has to be a part of the calculus for regime change in Venezuela. And by the way, and just for opponents of regime change, when I say that, I'm not talking about a U.S. military invasion. I'm talking about, something that's done internally. It's very important, this concept. Jared, you covered it early in the Global Sit Rep this morning, this concept of a government in waiting, basically have a government waiting in the wings to take over once the current government or current regime is toppled. That transition process is extremely important. And so it's another key indicator to me. If the United States is pressing for regime change in Venezuela, I think undoubtedly, obviously they are. It's very important that there is a transitional government, a provisional government willing to come in and able, not just willing, but also able to come in and have legitimacy of, this is not an American government. This is a Venezuelan government. This is a political opposition government. But having that government in waiting that can come in and assume the primary functions of government, and having that legitimacy is a key indicator to me that we're obviously pushing for it. Why else would we be promoting a government in waiting if we didn't want them to take over?
Exactly. and yeah.
Mm. All right. If a C5 is a goal, by the way, I'm not tracking what C5 or C6 is. Do you, Robert or Jared, do you know what this is in reference to?
No.
All right. If C5 is a goal, wouldn't it be optimal to let the remaining EU NATO members face down Russia alone as trial by fire? If they win, then they can replace Russia in the C5 or make it C6.
Maybe this is referring to the UN Permanent Security Council membership.
Okay. Not sure. Echo, if you can restate that or let me know what C5 is. All right. With gold and silver continuing to spike to record highs, are there any current systemic stresses in the economy that you're currently tracking? Well, yeah, every Friday I publish the economic early warning report, and I tell you what banks and hedge funds are telling their clients. So I will just tell you, there obviously are some stresses that they're concerned about. The consensus to me seems to be economic reacceleration in 26. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, all the big banks are saying they expect the U.S. economy to outperform next year. And actually, I think Goldman Sachs even said that they have a higher than consensus view on U.S. economic growth. I think they are projecting now 2.6% GDP growth next year. And listen, this is subject to change. These banks can often be wrong. But I'm just telling you, that's what they're saying now. I would say, Frozen Nomad, I would say it seems to me that they are seeing some of these stresses actually recede because they're talking about inflation moderating and actually inflation not being as bad a problem as they previously or some other people have been concerned about. Economic reacceleration next year. There's been some concern about whether AI is a bubble. And I will tell you that I believe it was Bank of America. Basically, I think Bank of America is, in a way, telling their clients we're facing down another 1929 style crash. And maybe we'll go into it on a different show, but it does not appear to me that that is imminent. They're not expecting it next year. Even I forget. I think it was Merrill came out and said we're still like early to mid stage of this. Even this AI, you want to call it a bubble, call it expansion, whatever, capex expansion. They say we're early to mid cycle on this. So it seems to me the consensus of the banks is that this can continue on for several more years. But I will point out again, Bank of America, in no uncertain terms, saying this is very reminiscent of a loosened. They talked about the Coolidge administration, how basically had this massive tech boom that coincided with a relaxing of regulations, and it was really great for the economy up until 1929. And so I at least Bank of America is talking about a bust eventually happening after this boom runs its course. If a national divorce was to happen, what happens to the nukes? I would imagine state. Well, listen, I don't know for sure. Robert or Jared, let's just hypothetically, it seems to me like there would still be components of the federal military that maintain control over the nuclear weapons. Maybe they get moved. Maybe the states, the individual states, maybe the new governments, I don't know, whatever takes responsibility for them. It's kind of too hypothetical for us to answer, but Jared, any thoughts there at all?
So preface this with I was not involved in any nuclear program. However, I've seen missiles launched a fair amount of times, and they always require multiple controlled physical items, keys normally, to actually launch. I'd have to imagine those are, if this were to happen, those keys would leave the area. And so it kind of wouldn't matter where the nukes are physically if the launch authority is not present.
I think on the political side, if we saw a national divorce, we would see a struggle with some states that have currently the physical access to nuclear missiles, want to maintain that. Obviously, I think in a post United States world, and then I think we could see something like South Africa, where at least on the federal side, once there's a recognition that this is happening, an attempt to effectively dismantle a nuclear program, potentially.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert and Jared. Yeah, so C5 is the core 5. Apparently this may be mentioned, I guess, in the classified version of the national security strategy. According to, I just looked it up here, Defense One said basically this core 5 or C5 group, United States, China, India, Russia, and Japan. Said, let me see here. Said basically they would be responsible for running the world. It would not be this single hegemonic power like the United States, basically breaking the world up into these various spheres of influence. So I think the question was, I don't know, Jared, can you help me find that initial question? And while you do that, okay, so if the core 5 is a goal, wouldn't it be optimal to let the remaining EU NATO members face down Russia alone as trial by fire? If they win, can they replace Russia in the C5 or make it C6 or no? Well, let's just look at this scenario. If European NATO and Russia do go to war and European NATO somehow defeats Russia, or, there's just innumerable number of ways that could happen, or the innumerable outcomes. I don't know. I would just tell you this. I think the EU as a bloc is probably too weak. But Jared, what say you?
Yeah, I think right now they are still too weak. I do want to caution that when this extended national security strategy first made the rounds, the administration immediately said, no, you have the whole thing. So, I mean, given they are obligated to say,
well, there's got to be a classified version of the national security strategy.
Yeah.
It all can't be unclass.
Right. I would be careful about putting too much stock into the idea of the core 5.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Last question here. Doesn't Cuba get its oil from Venezuela? Must be getting squeezed with the Venezuelan blockade. Well, Cuba's had fuel shortages and food shortages for at least the past couple of years. I want to say that goes back to at least 2022. One of those is either 22 or 23. Russia made an emergency delivery of food and fuel to Cuba. So they have had these really just plagued by ongoing problems. I don't know, Robert or Jared, do you know where Cuba gets most of its oil from? Venezuela seems to be kind of maybe an obvious answer.
Yeah, Venezuela has not only been providing them oil, but additional aid, which considering Cuba's power issues that have been plaguing them for the last 2 years, I think now. I do wonder if if a regime change in Venezuela would destabilize Cuba.
Which would also be a net benefit for the United States if the Cuban regime could get wrapped up at the same time. All right.
Sure would.
All right. Well, everyone, that's going to do it for today's show. We appreciate your questions. Thanks for watching. There are some questions that we didn't get to because they're just too in the weeds or outside of our purview, as some of these questions sometimes are. But we appreciate the support. With that, everyone have a great rest of your day. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.